Before we begin, a quick note. This podcast is a space for storytelling, shared experiences, and community. The views shared are personal and not medical, legal, or professional advice. If you're navigating a situation that requires professional support, please seek guidance from a qualified expert. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and most importantly, take care of yourself. Welcome to Who Cares About Me? This podcast exists to create space for caregivers to tell their stories, the good, the hard, and the complicated. There's no judgment here, no right way to do this. Just real experiences, reflection, and connection. Each episode features a small group of caregivers sharing what this role has looked like for them. Because caregiving is not one size fits all. If you've ever found yourself caring for a parent or grandparent and quietly wondering, who's taking care of me? Who cares about me? You're in the right place. This is Who Cares About Me, a podcast created to center the voices of parental caregivers. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy you're engaging with us today. I'm joined by Lori Stokes. Lori is a renowned American broadcast journalist who retired in September 2022 after a 40-year career, most notably as an anchor for Fox 5 News and WABC-TV in New York. She's an 8-time Emmy winner and serves on numerous boards, including the Cleveland Clinic. Lori is the only biological child of Jeanette and Louis Stokes and was in the role of caregiver for both parents off and on for 10 years. Lori, thank you so much for being here and sharing your caregiving story.
Thank you for inviting me, Jackee, to be on your podcast and such an important issue and one that affects so many of us, and not all of us are always prepared or know what to say about it.
Yeah, hopefully that'll change as we continue to bring light to this journey that so many of us are on. So let's get started with you and sharing a little bit with our listeners about your background and your childhood and the family that you started and your career and what your focus is now.
Okay, so where do I begin? Born in Cleveland, Ohio.
All right.
And I am one of 4 children. As you mentioned, I'm the only biological child of my mother, Jeanette, who likes to be known or did like to be known as Jay. And of course, my dad, Louis Stokes. And I have 3 half siblings from my dad's first marriage, but we all grew up under the same roof. I probably had the most magnificent childhood that anyone could imagine. I was very loved. I had a beautiful relationship with my mom and my dad. I was my mom's, as I said, only biological child. She was told early on in her life that she couldn't, because of an illness, have children. And so I sort of had the moniker of the miracle child, which, of course, I probably used to my advantage sometimes. But my dad was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1968. So we moved from Cleveland to Silver Spring, Maryland. And so that's where I really grew up. And, you know, the days when you stayed outside and playing kickball all day and you came back for dinner time and you explored and you always felt safe wherever you were. And I was always an imaginative child, acting classes and writing classes and all of that. And so when it came time for me to begin thinking about a career, I wanted a career where I could be a writer. I loved Sidney Sheldon. I was a big Sidney Sheldon fan, and all I wanted to do was to write kind of, you know, romance novels. And so when I decided to go to Ohio State University, I was an English major, and but I was under an independent study course, and which meant if you wanted to go to class, you could go to class. And I worked on Capitol Hill for a while, and then I realized I needed to go back to school. So I went to Howard University, changed my major to broadcast journalism. And that is when really my life began as a journalist. It was that eureka moment of, wow, this is where I belong. I did several internships, one of which was 1984 at CBS News in New York. So amazing, sitting and watching Dan Rather deliver the news getting to know Ed Bradley,
Mm-hmm.
um, peeking in at 60 Minutes and just really seeing what it was all about. So when I went back to Howard, I got a job working at a television station, the CBS station, running teleprompter in the morning, then go over to Howard. And 3 years later, I was told, Stokes, you need to be on the other side of the camera.
All right.
And the great Bruce Johnson was so instrumental in helping me. He said, just take my stories, voice them, go out and do a stand-up and send your tapes out. So I did that. My brother, Chuck, who works at WXYZ in Detroit, gave me the best advice ever to apply to stations where they're used to a big turnover in college towns. And I was fortunate to get a job anchoring on the weekends in Champaign-Urbana. And 10 months later, went to Charlotte, Charlotte to Baltimore, Baltimore to DC, DC to MSNBC, MSNBC to WABC, and then to Fox 5.
Wow.
And, along the way, just, I think it was, as a Black woman, wasn't always easy. There were challenges certainly along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never one to do things the Orthodox way. So my oldest daughter, Alexandra, is 33, and Nicolette is 31. And yes, they are the apple of my eye. So, yeah, I think that's all you really want in life when you have children. You just want to know that they are self-sufficient, that they're kind human beings,
Mm-hmm.
that, they're healthy mentally and physically. And if you're not here one day, they're going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, I grew up watching you on TV in the New York area and followed your journey when you were talking about your caregiving with your parents, and was one of the first people I thought about when I wanted to start this journey of podcasting and bringing these stories to light. So thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this. Let's get into your dad, because I think there's a lot of fun history there, and your mom.
Okay.
What were they like, and what was your relationship like with them growing up and into adulthood? Because it's just such a fascinating story, your family story.
Well, I think that family was really the key with both of them. I told you that my mom um, was told she couldn't have children. She had rheumatic fever as a little girl, and it developed into rheumatic heart disease, and she was always advised she could never have kids. But she was always one of those individuals who loved being around young people. And my dad lost his father when he was 3 years old of acute peritonitis. And so he never knew his father. His mother raised him and his brother Carl as a domestic. And it was the one thing he always talked about was, not knowing his father, but wanting to be a father.
Mm-hmm.
When he was running for Congress, he talked about how he was campaigning. He went to a laundromat, and some women who had worked with his father and knew his father told him, Lou, I just want you to know your father was so proud of you and Carl. He talked about you so much. He always smiled. And I think that really stuck with my dad. He was a tremendous father. Everything really revolved around his 4 children. And he had an individual relationship with each and every one of us. I think by the time the baby comes along, it's a little different.
Mm-hmm.
My relationship with my dad was one of, we didn't hold back saying what was on our mind at
Mm-hmm.
any time. And he would always tease me that sometimes I would give him too much information. And whether it was about boyfriends or, and then work. When he was elected to Congress, he moved to DC. So my mom held down the fort for 2 years while we were in Cleveland. And she was 22 when they got married. And all of a sudden she had 3 little children. And so, imagine today, I can't imagine if I was 22 raising a 5, 7, and a 9-year-old. I just
Right.
cannot
Yeah.
even imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But she was artistic. She was a great artist. And she worked for the Department of Education here in Cleveland. And she was very no nonsense, but soft. She didn't like to be in the limelight. She let my dad do that. But she was, without a doubt, the force behind him. And he would always acknowledge that in any speeches that he gave. It was a happy childhood of doing everything and anything. And when I mentioned him in Congress, for me, that was great because I was kind of like, I was a closer at 6 years old.
Yeah.
They would bring out Lori to, stand on the stage and
Mm-hmm.
to say some words and have the pigtails and, very grassroots effort going door to door. Who could resist a little kid saying, vote for my daddy on November 7th.
Right.
And so it's kind of all I ever knew was being around adults
Mm-hmm.
and being in this world that was sort of larger than life and also at a really pivotal time in our history of civil rights movement and having people in our home that were only names that you read about, Jesse Jackson and Martin Luther King, the movers and shakers. And you felt like you were really caught up in something very important. Yeah.
Well, let's start with your dad.
Okay.
And when did that journey begin for you when it came to caregiving with him and what illness was he battling?
I think that when he really needed care was in 2013. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked if I would come to Cleveland. And we had a home in Silver Spring, but as the years went on, more and more, they stayed at a home here in Ohio, in Pepper Pike. And he asked me if I would come to help him through it. He even leading up to that, it was interesting. Diagnosed in 2013, and he wanted to have Christmas dinner at the house in Pepper Pike with everybody coming. So I was the cook of the family. It was not my mother's favorite thing at all. So there were about 25 of us. And I remember it was just snowing, and he had not discussed it with everybody. But he didn't know what this diagnosis meant. And he didn't know if it was going to be his last Christmas. So he wanted just to be surrounded by family and laughter and good food and jazz music and whatever sports event was on TV. And so I came in for that in 2013. And then in the beginning of the next year is when he went in for his surgery. And I was able to take time off from WABC. They were gracious enough to allow me to do that. And he had designated me as his health advocate when we were going to go in for surgery. And it was very interesting because his brother Carl had died of esophageal cancer. And he used to always tell me this story, how he went with Carl to Sloan Kettering for an examination and surgery. And they went in. He said Carl went in. He saw him go into the operating room and came out in less than 30 minutes. And the doctor had said, we opened up. There's nothing we can do. So when we were going to the hospital that morning for my dad's surgery, it was 6 o'clock we left, and he just kept saying to me, man, I hope I'm in there longer than 30 minutes. And he said, if I come back out in 30 minutes, honey, then you know. And I said, don't worry, it'll be fine. We got to the hospital, they gave me the pager. He went into the operating room, and I just remember looking at that clock.
Yeah.
And when it went past 30 minutes, and the hope that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say about maybe an hour or so later, he came out, and his Dr. Strong at the time, he said everything went beautifully. And, do you want to go see your dad?
Yeah.
So it was a long recovery, though, because, you are given all the instructions of the foods, the soft foods they can
Mm-hmm.
have,
Mm-hmm.
and, the daily medication and just the day-to-day routine. And so once he was out of the hospital and, had to provide all the comforts for him and learn about the prescriptions and running to CVS and taking care of this and taking care of that, and also the mental part of keeping him in a good state of mind. Because my dad was such a go-getter and, flying all the time, giving speeches nonstop. And this was a moment where his body told him, Lou, you have to stop. And it was, reckoning with that. We had gotten him to a really good place. And I told him, I have to go back to work, Daddy. And it was the beginning of April. I want to say it was April 1st.
Mm-hmm.
And I had gone to the airport to Cleveland Hopkins. I was returning the rent-a-car, and I got a call from a relative that my dad had gone into the emergency room and that they were going to have to do surgery again. Now, this is about a 3-week span.
Wow.
And what had happened was his intestines had wrapped around something, and it had caused distress. Mm-hmm. So here was this 88-year-old who had to go back into surgery. And I remember calling the WABC and saying,
sorry.
Around. They were like, do what you gotta do.
Yeah.
When he came out that time, after that surgery, it was really good. He was very positive. I took care of him again, and he was back. He was doing his thing again. He was flying. He was giving speeches again. And then a year later is when I got another call from him. Of course, we talked all the time, but talking about those calls.
Yeah.
In early June, a diagnosis of brain cancer.
I'm sorry.
And that was that was a journey.
Yeah.
That was a journey that I really, I was physically prepared for. I was mentally prepared for, but it was on such a different level from the colon cancer.
Yeah.
It was really on a different level.
When we had spoken before, you had mentioned that your mom had gotten sick in 2011.
Right. So
how was the balance with both of them? What was happening with her during that time?
The one thing really that I think is so important as a caregiver to take notes about things, because you forget a lot.
Yeah.
And actually, so is it okay if I read?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So my mother had surgery in 2011, a routine surgery, which she had told me that I didn't need to come to Cleveland. So as I told you, she had rheumatic heart disease. So she was always on Coumadin, which is a blood thinner.
Yes.
But to have the surgery, she had to go off of the Coumadin. Mm-hmm. Because there could be excessive bleeding. So 2011, this was Hurricane Irene. And I write, Hurricane Irene, I was packing and ready to stay in the city. Now, I need to add that my news director had told all of us that we needed to be in the city because with Hurricane Irene coming in, he didn't want any excuses for anyone not being able to get into the city for our broadcast.
And for those who don't live in the tri-state area, we call the city New York City.
Yes, sorry. I know. It's way too familiar. You were so right. Okay, so As Hurricane Irene was approaching, I was packed. I was ready to stay in the city. Mommy had had her surgery on a Tuesday of that week, and I will always regret not being in Cleveland for her surgery. She had told me, honey, I'll be fine. The doctors warned her she could have a stroke, but I think we all thought it would be on the operating table. She came through the surgery fine, but they had to take her off the Coumadin because they didn't want her to be on her blood thinner and have surgery. But she had excessive bleeding. They had to wait to administer the Coumadin. By the time they started her back on it, Friday, it wasn't soon enough, and it didn't get through her system quickly enough. So on that Saturday, around 2 o'clock or so, I was talking with her on the phone and waiting for Mike Bloomberg, who of course was the mayor at the time, to come on the air to talk about Hurricane Irene preps. Mommy sounded a little extra chill and not very motivated. I told her she should go to the mall and walk and start moving and get exercise. She told me she would maybe tomorrow, but she just didn't feel like it. And I told her, Mommy, I gotta go. Bloomberg is on the TV and talking about Hurricane Irene, and I would call her back around 5 o'clock. Daddy called me. I'll never forget his voice. He was so panicked and scared. He said, honey, something has happened to Mommy. I have an ambulance on the way. I think Mommy might have had a stroke. I said, okay, Daddy, I'll call work. I'll call you back. Kenny and Dave, my news director, my general manager at the time, didn't hesitate. They told me to do whatever I needed to do. Kenny, Lori, head west, just head west. Then I got in the car, for the first time, drove to Cleveland by myself through Hurricane Irene. Daddy called me to update me again, his voice of fear, telling me that when they got to University Hospital, the CAT scan showed that she had a blood clot, and she had to be life-lifted to University Hospital for emergency brain surgery to remove the clot. My mother, who is terrified of flying, had no hesitation and remembers being hoisted into a helicopter and rushed to University Hospital. Surgery took 2 hours, and all the while I was on 80 West, driving through pouring rain and construction and navigating the interstate I was unfamiliar with. Big rigs on both sides, but again, Daddy taught me how to drive on the highway. So when I got to the hospital, maybe 3 a.m, something like that, and saw my mother there in intensive care, for anyone who's ever seen a parent in intensive care or anyone they love, it's pretty jolting.
Yeah.
And she knew I was there, and I spoke with all the doctors, and I began to understand the road I was going to have to be on. I remember going home, talking to my dad, a couple hours coming back. But so she had a stroke. The surgery was successful. I'll never know that doctor. We have tried to find that doctor who just happened to be on call that night and was an angel to save her life. She had what's called aphasia. So you understand what people are saying to you, but your communicative skills are not as strong. It was really starting from ground zero with my mother. I've saved everything she wrote, but I even saved the things once she had the stroke, and to see the difference, in her penmanship. So yes, that was 2011. Then followed by my dad with 2013, and then 2015. After my dad passed, I had moved my mom into an independent living facility, and then assisted living, and then memory care. And so it has been a long journey of some of the things that you don't remember and some things that you do remember. Consolidating things in the Maryland house and showing her an iPad of the furniture in the Maryland house and telling her to point to me the furniture that she wants me to have moved, dealing with lawyers and and accountants and being their advocate, being that voice when they cannot speak, making the decisions, putting things in trust, being that cyclical process of being the parent again.
Yes.
Being the parent for them, but making sure they always have their dignity and never letting them feel as if you're taking over.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act. And when I was taking care of my dad in 2013 and 15, my mom was still not her regular self. And all the while, it takes a toll.
These stories are so profound, Lori. And I want to know, as a daughter, how did it feel emotionally to watch your parents shift from being these protectors and almost superhumans for you to them needing that protection? And can you talk me through, how you got through that and some of the emotions that you had?
Well, I think that there were years leading up to this, not necessarily knowing it to this degree, but there were years where, I would go to the house and do laundry, particularly after my mom had her stroke. I would drive from Jersey to Maryland, and she had become so overwhelmed with everything. My siblings had all left for college or, their career paths. I was always the remaining kid in the house. So, and my mom would sometimes have to go into the hospital. So I had to sort of be trained about how to wash things, what to cook. So from an early age, starting from junior high, I was being trained, I guess, without, it was just family life, but it really did prepare me. And so my mom, after her stroke, would sometimes have those, large white kitchen bags that she had put my dad's shirts in. And I later found them in her closet. He would say to me, I don't know what this woman is doing with my undershirts. I can't find them anywhere. And he'd go to Nordstrom and buy some new undershirts.
Yeah.
So, I would wash them. I would fold them, the way he liked them. I would do the handkerchiefs, the whole thing. I would cook them some meals. I would do some prep and put in the freezer and then write directions on how for them to fix it. So when it really came the nitty gritty time, I think I was ready.
Yeah.
I was ready in the basics of caregiving. And I think that there was no shame from my parents. My father used to say to me, honey, I just don't want to be a burden to you.
Yeah.
And I would tell him it wasn't a burden. It was an honor, and I was blessed that I was able to be in a position in my career where I could take that time off and do whatever I needed for either one of them. Now, there were times where I maybe felt a little bossy, and my mother would say, now, wait a minute.
I know.
And
I've gotten that wait a minute, or the look and the point of the finger. Look, don't be telling me what to do.
Exactly. Or I would get that, who are you talking to? So, and it was really a wonderful moment because it would take me back, when I was a smart aleck at times, way before these years. But there was, particularly with my father, we were a team in the caregiving because he was so cognizant of everything.
Yeah. It was almost like you all were tag teaming.
Yes, we worked really closely. And, when he went in for the colon surgery, my gift was cooking. So he knew that I was always going to, that I was going to follow directions on what needed to be done, that I was going to do all the errands. I knew their way of life. I know what they liked. I think with the diagnosis also of the brain cancer, that was one of really relinquishing his care to me. He had no problem sharing whatever information, would look to me when the doctor would say something, what do you think? And so when he was ill with the brain cancer, and I had basically moved in, and I had to administer different medications, insulin and different pills. And I had one of those whiteboards, and I would write out everything for him. I would put gloves on. I would, I gotten those little alcohol
prep pads,
squares, and I would say, okay, Daddy, now we're going to do this, and now we're going to do that. And my dad he had OCD. He loved everything to be very pristine, as did my mother.
Did you know all these tasks would help to build trust?
I knew that I had to do these things in this way for him to have complete trust. And he acknowledged it so much also. Honey, thank you for, doing this and doing that. And I remember when the last time he was in the hospital, it was in July. And well, we had a list of things I had to get: a bedside commode. I had to get, a walker, a wheelchair, all of these equipment to take to the home, or else they wouldn't release him.
Yeah.
And you had to have all those components before you, could have him released. And I remember when we left, I was pushing him in the wheelchair, and the entire staff at Cleveland Clinic on that floor gave him a standing ovation.
Oh.
And it was at that moment I knew that was the last time that he would be in the hospital. I knew that they knew.
Yeah.
That was it. And so when we got home, it was kind of it was business. It was, let's make the last days, weeks, months of my life, let's make it the best. And that is really what I tried to do, just to really make it quality. And I was blessed in that they trusted me.
Yeah.
They just really trusted me. And I trusted myself. And I kept being told, whatever you do is right. Don't second guess it. Make the decision and do it. And there were a lot of intimate moments, both verbally, talking about my dad now, the physical part, the work that you have to do with them, things that a daughter doesn't always think she'll ever have to do. And I remember I just finished washing him, and I put my hands on his shoulders, and he said, I feel your love, baby.
Yeah.
And, you sort of divorce yourself from, this is my dad, I'm doing this because it has to be done. What I mean? You see them vulnerable, but you feel the physical and the mental demand that you're just doing so much that you forget that you can't be the appropriate or the best caregiver unless you find ways to give to yourself.
All these years you're reporting all these difficult stories, and you've got this professional composure, and those times when you had that private exhaustion with your mom and dad, or you're facing a hard reality, when it's your family, how did you maybe take a little bit of how you handled yourself professionally into your caregiving journey, or vice versa?
But when I decided to be a broadcaster, I had, my uncle Carl was not only America's first Black mayor for a major U.S. city, but he was also New York's first Black nighttime anchor and at WNBC. And he was selling his house here in Cleveland. He was getting ready to become the ambassador to the Seychelles Islands under Clinton's administration. And so he was having a estate sale. So I went to the estate sale, and he gave me his one and only Emmy, and he gave me these like brass pelicans.
Okay.
But more than that, he gave me great pieces of wisdom as I went into journalism. And two of the things he told me was to never become jaded by the stories that we report on. And to always remember, although the story might look the same, the people are different. And to always take the time to know the story, give those individuals their respect. And so I think I always took that into all of my storytelling for 40 years, that it might be another fire, it might be another murder, it might be someone who's lost their child, it might be another city council meeting. Whatever it is, everyone has a story. Everyone should be treated with kindness and with respect. And of course, also in the business, I believe that we shouldn't show our emotions, that we have to stay calm,
Yes.
And then there are times when you can break down. And I knew, while taking care of my parents, they had to see me as a strong person, and they had to see me focused and as their best advocate, and they couldn't see me waver on things or be indecisive. And I also had to let them know they were safe. And so I think probably there is an overlap. I never thought about it really. And I think it's okay to have those moments though also, where you let them see just, how important they are to you, how much you love them, how losing them is going to break your heart.
Yeah.
But with my relationship with my dad and my mom, I was fortunate in that I never had to, I've never been that child who, when your parent is dying, that I feel I have to say a million different things.
Yeah.
I had said everything to them my entire life.
Yeah.
There was, I was blessed in that there was nothing that I had to apologize for or explain or ask forgiveness for or any of those conversations.
How was taking care of your mom different from taking care of your dad?
So my mom had Alzheimer's and dementia. So taking care of her was totally different from taking care of my dad. In fact, when I talked to my mother's doctor, who was also my dad's doctor, and I said, Dr. Lang, I'm going to move my mother into my house for this last month and take care of her. And he said, well, I don't know. It's going to be a lot different from your dad. Your dad worked with you. Your mother has dementia and Alzheimer's. And I said to him, I was like, it's okay. I can do it. And it's very interesting because I had caregivers for my dad come in like, I don't know, maybe 2-3 hours a day in midday. So I could run, do errands, but I would take care of him in the morning. I'd take care of him in the night. And sometimes I'd, vary the hours. Um, with my mother, I ended up, I had caregivers, but I also had one of those baby monitors.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to have someone who could be there with my mother during the nighttime so I could get some rest, so I could take care of her during the day. Whereas with my dad, I was kind of 24 hours with him, with the exception of these pockets.
Yeah.
But with the baby monitor, I would watch the caregivers doze off,
Oh, boy.
sitting on the sofa across from my mother.
Mm-hmm.
So I must have gone through 5 of them,
Yeah.
with video of them sleeping. So as a result, both of my daughters were here whenever they could take off from work, and then myself. And so we would just rotate. One of us always sleeping downstairs.
Yeah.
And talk about looking haggard. I mean, it was a rough time. I mean, this sister was not looking good at all. But it was, I would bring down like a box of photos to show my mom.
Yeah.
And I would say, do you know who that is?
Mm-hmm.
And she would point to it and she'd say, is that me? And I'd say, yes, that's you. Aren't you gorgeous? And she would say, And, I didn't, with my mom, I couldn't work with her. We couldn't work as a team.
Yeah.
I had to really have much more of a motherly role.
Yeah.
And it was, she was childlike at times.
Mm-hmm.
So, and accepting of it, and knew that she was in a safe space.
Yeah.
And her sister, who's her Irish twin, who's 10 months older, would come over, and I would fix them homemade tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. And they'd sit at my counter like the 2 little girls that they were.
Yeah.
I'd take them out of my porch. I'd wash my mother's hair out in the sun. I'd give her some of her Moscato,
Mm-hmm.
and she'd sip her, her wine and sit and look at, the butterflies. And so it was on a very different level. I just took good care of her, and it was also interesting as they began to have the moments of early transitioning and starting to see friends, loved ones, beyond, hallucinating, whatever it is. With my dad, it was wonderment when he would look and see his mom or his brother or dear friends. He had this like boyish look in his eyes, like, wow, wow.
Mm-hmm.
With my mom, she was frightened.
Okay.
Because she didn't recognize these figures, these people.
Yes.
And so that was something I had not been exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to consult to learn the best way to calm her, whether it was a gummy or, which she was okay with, or, just trying to distract her, or the fear factor was so dominating with a lot,
Lori, I'm so curious, as someone that's in the public eye and was very much in the public eye around this time, did you ever feel any pressure to keep any of this private? Or did you at one point just say, I'm going to share it with the world? How did you battle with that and come to your final decision on how you were going to approach this, knowing that you were in the public eye?
Being in morning anchor for so much of my life, it's a different beast than a nighttime anchor.
Mm-hmm.
Viewers were let into my world all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They knew my little girls, Alex and Nikki. They knew when I got divorced. I was an open book, and that was really one of the keys to my success.
Mm-hmm.
Was you are being gracious enough to allow me to come in your home and be a part of your family, and you are an extension of my family too. And so I never personally had a problem with sharing my life events, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with my viewers.
Mm-hmm.
And I would receive, calls, emails, letters about whatever I was going through.
Yeah.
Of just kindness,
Yeah.
empathy, sympathy, congratulations, whatever it was. I don't believe we ever shared the colon cancer in the time that I was away then. We did not let anyone know anything in June when I first went. We crafted a press release. There were a couple reporters that he gave a reporter to. He gave an interview to a reporter here in Cleveland that had followed his career for many years and was one of those diehard great old journalists,
Mm-hmm.
and an adversarial role at times and a great friend at others. And they had done an interview about his life. He had
Mm-hmm.
covered my dad and Carl, and he said that the interview was not to come out until after his death.
Okay.
So he had already done that, and Brent Larkin is his name, and Brent knew, ultimately that it was terminal. We put out a press release, and there was a front page article about my dad battling brain and lung cancer. And that was in, I think, early July of 2015, and asking for our privacy.
Mm-hmm.
I never discussed anything on the air at WABC. Of course, my boss knew.
Sure.
But I never said anything on, any social media. My dad went for a checkup, and his doctor, Dr. Lang, said, "Lou, I want you to get your affairs in order and love your family." And even then, we didn't say anything. And I had to, aside from what we put out in the newspaper about him battling, I had to respect his wishes. And I really didn't, I popped into work. I was gone for 3 months, but I went back a couple of times. So people saw me on the air maybe a week out of 3 months, kind of choppy. I wasn't prepared to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I just wasn't, and there are things, it's interesting, when my dad died and the funeral we had, which standing room only, people outside of the church. And the one thing that I asked for was that we have a private burial. And that was something and that was only because I felt that I had shared my father for my entire life. And I just felt that moment should just be with his family. I don't think until I went back to work at WABC did I then, say something about why I was gone and my dad. And of course, just flooded with just wonderful, beautiful things from so many people, viewers and national figures, Dr. Fauci and Nancy Pelosi and, just all people from all walks of life. With my mother, when I left to take care of my mother, I put on Instagram a picture of her the back of her in a wheelchair, me sitting next to her, and
I remember that
head on her
picture.
shoulder.
I remember that picture. Yes.
Yeah. And that was all I did until, she passed. And then when I went back to Fox, I, did make a statement on the day I came back about it. And I have to say, that is one thing. I mean, just like you and your husband have talked about my role as a caregiver, that I felt that by talking about it with the viewers, really connected with so many people, because sometimes you think you're alone. And I think when you're in a caregiving position, you really need to know you're not. And because it can be lonely.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And not everyone, and for those people who are not caregivers and it's not their thing, that's okay too.
Absolutely.
Because we all have our strengths. Even with my girls, I know which one's going to handle what.
Yes.
And that's okay. There are some people who they're going to do the nuts and bolts. They're going to get it, and then there's the one who's going to carry the load of the day in, day out.
And you got to get right with it.
Yeah.
You got to get right with it.
And you can't think that one's better than the other or any of that. That's why we might have come from the same people, but we're just individuals. And know your strength and embrace it.
Yes.
And be okay with it.
Yeah.
The night that died, we were putting the finishing touches on the press release, and I was speaking on the phone with members of his staff and my siblings, and they were letting their children know. One person wanted me to wait to release the press conference and to let the media know. And this was the journalist in me. And I knew that if I waited, that it wouldn't be the top story. And I knew that this man who had dedicated his life to public service, who had, 30 years as a congressman and an attorney who argued for the Supreme Court, I didn't want it to get lost. Yeah. And it was like, but when you talk about those worlds colliding, the journalist and this, I wasn't going to have it, become buried somewhere along the line. This was going to be the top story.
Yeah.
And so it's that blending of the world and knowing, how to handle.
And how to respect your father's legacy properly. If anybody knows how to do that, you know how to do that. Properly.
It was really important to me, and I had to override somebody. And I had no apologies for it. And again, it speaks to that, making a decision.
Yeah.
And not all decisions are going to be right.
Right.
Was. Yeah. But, when you're in that position, because each thing's different. So, yeah. And even for my mom, it was interesting. My daughters wrote the obituary while my mom was here.
Yeah.
We kept reading it out, and it was almost, and Jay did this and had this career and won this award and blah, blah, blah. And I remember us saying, okay, is this the last version? And we said, yeah, read it one more time.
Yeah.
My mother was absorbing it and saying to herself, okay, yeah, let's go with it. Yeah. Because it was either the next day or 2 days later that she left.
Oh,
So, and I was like, is this not right to do, to read an obituary in front of the person who's.
Oh, Lori, my mom's, she and I sat down and did this years ago
Oh, okay.
because I come from a West Indian family. And if she doesn't have a say in it and she's not here, everybody's going to have an opinion. So I wanted to avoid all the opinions.
Right.
And just be able to say, this is what she wanted it to say. This is the service that she wants to have. These are the hymns she wants to sing. These are the people she wants to speak. And there's no question about how this is going to go. So we did that very early on, and she really embraced it. And, I think it's one of those things where sometimes some people just don't even think about it, or they feel uncomfortable about those conversations. But,
right.
To give the person you loved and took care of for so long exactly what they wish, there's something really special about that. And I'm sure your mom was happy.
No, I think she was.
She got what she wanted in that obituary.
No, I think she was too.
Yeah.
I think she was. And I think that those are those moments that are also cathartic for the people who are caring for them.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? I think it also gives you something else other than prepping this or doing that.
Because there's so much tactical, logistical in the day to day. And sometimes you need time for that emotional part of it. And I want to take a minute to reflect on the conversation and the fact that, we get into this moment where we're a caregiver and there's so many feelings that come up again and again for caregivers. And we just talked about being prepared, sometimes being unprepared, and stepping in, and the feelings of obligation. But once you're in it and you step in, I think caregiving can really reveal so much about you as a person and you and your family, all those things. And, it can either soften you, it can harden you, it can strengthen you, it can change what you value in the future. And it definitely does change us all in one way, shape, or form. And I'm just so thankful for these stories that you've told today. And I really want to get into how you supported yourself. And what did you do to really make sure that you were taking care of yourself? So I have a couple questions that I usually share at the end of the episode that are just about you. How did you care for yourself during this 10-year stint? And, especially you're working as well. What did you do to give yourself some respite during this time?
Tequila?
I mean, I'm not mad at it. I'm not mad at it.
My work gave me great satisfaction.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved being a broadcaster. I'm not a morning person, but I loved doing morning TV.
Yeah, sure.
And I loved news. And I got a lot of satisfaction out of speaking to people I knew. And so I never really thought about, let me go get a massage. Let me go take a quick trip somewhere. It, on the other hand, I also loved taking care of my parents. And the joy that I gave them to be able to reciprocate what they gave me.
Yeah.
When I took care of my mom and my dad, I was in really great shape.
Yeah.
I was cycling, I was strength training, I was, eating great. I was everything. I was super strong. And in some way, I think all of that was really a precursor to me being able to take care of my dad the way I did without me knowing. I have to say, also friends.
Yeah.
I had a core group of girlfriends and a couple guy friends that gave me immeasurable strength.
Yeah.
They loved on them while they were here.
Yeah.
And then when they were not here,
Yes.
because I can tell you, I know for sure that I could have never made it through the journey and ultimately the death, and then even following their deaths without them.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you another person, Bill Ritter.
Oh, Bill Ritter. Yes.
Bill Ritter. Oh my God. Bill was so instrumental when I was taking care of my dad, because there were times when I had guilt that I should be at work.
Mm-hmm.
And he would call me and he'd say, Stokes, you're exactly where you need to be.
Yeah.
And he would say, don't think for 1 minute. This place is going to be here. Don't you worry. And so I remember when my dad passed, his doctor had told me that morning, August 18th, he said, I think your dad's going to go tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, do you really? And he said, yeah, I do. And I said, oh, okay. So my mother and I we had moved the bed into the living room. And my mom and I were talking to him. And I said, Mommy, you know what? I am going to run to this restaurant, go have a quick glass of wine, and I'm going to come home.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of late. It was 9. Usually I would leave around 6 for a half hour or so. Anyway, now my mother, mind you, did not know anybody's phone number and didn't really know how to use a telephone very well.
Mm-hmm.
And we were standing with my dad, and she said, how long are you going to be gone? I said, 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, okay. So I left, and I had just ordered the glass of wine, and the phone rang.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my mother. And she said, honey, Daddy died.
Oh.
And I was like, I said to the bartender, he said, go.
Yeah.
I get back to the house, and my mom and I sat with him. We opened a bottle of champagne, and we just sat there and talked to him, talked about how cute he was. But I told Bill, I said, Bill, I had been with my father every single second of every day around the clock.
Yeah.
And when I left is when he died.
Yeah.
And he said to me, he said, Stokes, this isn't about you.
Oh, okay, Bill.
He said, he needed you to live. He didn't need you to die. And he said he was with who he wanted to be with.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah.
All right. Shout out to Bill Ritter.
And I ended up giving Bill one of my dad's ties, and he wears it every election. And he sits on the set, and he always says, Lori Stokes gave me this tie. Aww. This was her dad, Congressman Stokes' tie. But no, there are so many, and you'll reflect once people are gone on those moments of different things that people said to you that maybe at that moment you didn't even know was lifting you and carrying you to continue being what you needed to be as a caregiver. And then you sit back and you just reflect on knowing that you really could not have made it if it had not been for these special people who came in and out of your life and saw, answer the call.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even expecting it, but it was just, I'll be forever grateful to my friends for all of that.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful thing to reflect on. Yeah.
Yeah. And my little girls, telling you, who are not so little,
right?
But my dad and my mom had such beautiful individual relationships with all their grandkids. Deep friendships.
Yeah.
Deep conversations, and words of wisdom, both, back and forth. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And in fact, all the grandkids spoke at my dad's funeral and my mom's. And for them also to be in those positions of kind of as caregivers at different times, particularly my daughters were there as caregivers with both my parents. And, and for me, they were there to be my wind beneath my wings as well.
Well, Lori, I want to thank you so much for this story and this day. And, this episode is called When Caregiving Finds You. And what I'm struck by is that caregiving found you in the middle of life, in your career. And like most moments in caregiving, it didn't ask if it was convenient, didn't check your schedule, it just arrived. And what stands out for me in this conversation is that it doesn't discriminate. It finds journalists, it finds executives, daughters, sons, it finds us all. And no matter how we're prepared, where we are in life, I don't think anyone's really prepared for the moment when these roles shift and we become that steady hand for the people who once steadied us. And it's a very heavy feeling, but what I'm getting from your story is that it can also be quite sacred. And it's one of the last ways we can show gratitude for the people who raised us and inspired us.
It's that finding that full closure.
Yeah.
And just doing your very best, as you said, for the ones who lifted us and stood there as a pillar.
Yeah.
And so, I think what you're doing is really beautiful, really needed. And each of these experiences are so personal, so individual. There's no how-to book. But knowing, again, that you are not alone in this, and the decisions that you make are the right decisions, I think allow you to rest easy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Lori, for trusting me with this chapter of your story. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care. You can listen and subscribe to Who Cares About Me wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to follow, connect with us, check out resources, or share your story, head to Who Cares About Me on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Subscribe on Substack and YouTube, and like, or visit whocaresaboutmepodcast.com. Who Cares About Me is hosted and produced by me, Jackee de Lagarde. Clarence Steele is our editor and producer, and also created our theme music. And graphics created by Jonathan de Lagarde of Hollis Arts, LLC.